Democrats' Green New Deal, which would replace planes with high-speed trains. At least 6 Democratic senators running or considering running for president are co-sponsoring it. Should they be worried about it? Well, we are on it. With Senate Majority Whip John Thune on that upcoming vote, he's here in just a moment. But first, Peter Doocy on Capitol Hill with the fallout from all of this. Peter.
Charles, Mitch McConnell wants to give anybody in the Senate who supports the very bold and aggressive provisions of the Green New Deal a chance to vote for it. But we caught up with one of the co-sponsors, Democratic candidate Kirsten Gillibrand, who says she doesn't think that's necessarily fair.
I think this is an opportunity for us to talk about a vision for this country that is exciting. And so if we have a vote, we have a vote, and we can be what we're for. But I think the vote being called today is just a political stunt.
Senator Gillibrand joins Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris as presidential candidates co-sponsoring the bold Green New Deal, which calls for quickly transforming society until nobody relies on fossil fuel. But there's no legislative text putting the Green New Deal's ideas into a specific bill or resolution. And that's why the Senate sponsor, Ed Markey, says this: don't let Mitch McConnell fool you. This is nothing but an attempt to sabotage the movement we are building. He wants to silence your voice so Republicans don't have to explain why they are climate change deniers. McConnell wants this to be the end. This is just the beginning. Republican critics of the resolution have been referring regularly to frequently asked questions that were published and then retracted by Green New Deal supporters, and they suggested a future without airplanes or cows, which Iowa's Chuck Grassley has a problem with.
A lot of people in this country, mostly city slickers, that think food grows in supermarkets and not on farms. I think it's very unrealistic.
I caught up with Senator Kamala Harris, another candidate, earlier today, asked her if she is supportive of this vote, and she said she supports the Green New Deal, and her office points out she wouldn't be a co-sponsor of the measure if she didn't want to actually have a vote on it. Charles.
Makes sense. Hey, thank you very much, Peter. Well, if Democrats want it, how come many of them are very reluctant to vote on it? With me now, Conservative Review's Deneen Borelli, Run for America CEO David Bernstein, and Fox Business Network's Ashley Webster. Deneen, let me start with you. It's immediately the Democrats calling this a stunt, but I thought, hey, this is what you want. You're getting a lot of publicity from it. All the presidential candidates on the Democratic side have rallied around this. Why not vote on it?
Yeah, make up your mind, right? This is a fundamental transformation of America on steroids, because this is a sweeping agenda for more government control and intervention in our everyday lives. So, yeah, why would they not want to go on the record? Because they would have to defend this to their constituents. And the constituents need to know who supports this and who does not, because this will affect all Americans if this is something that the utopia that the Democrats want to go through.
David, of course, we're hearing that it's broad strokes. There's a lot to be filled in, but it starts the conversation. But a vote would also allow Americans to see who's for what at this particular time.
Well, look, I think they should have a vote on it, frankly. And, as Senator Harris said, why propose bills if you don't want to vote on it? I think we actually have become engaged in a politics, and Mitch McConnell is responsible for this to some degree as well. There's broad bipartisan support in the Senate for all sorts of bills that Mitch McConnell doesn't want to bring up for a vote. It's obvious that he wants to bring this up, not just because he wants the Democrats to have a choice.
Why do you think he wants to bring it up? Why do you think he thinks Democrats are embarrassed by it?
Because I think he realizes that the bill is that the thinking on it is not fully matured, that mostly it's been a talking point, and it's not it's not really an actually well-formed piece of legislation, right? And he knows that people are running for president, and this is going to be something that people are going to have to go on record about. He knows it's going to fail. Let's be clear. If Mitch McConnell thought there was a chance this would pass, he would not be bringing it up for a vote.
Right, but Ashley, the broad strokes part of it with the no airplanes and.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, but presidential candidates have glommed onto it. They're saying, hey, I'm on this platform as well.
I can only imagine they did that before actually reading it. It's only 14 pages long, but it's complete fantasy. And from the business side of things, how the heck are you going to pay for this? Tens of trillions of dollars. They'll run up the national debt, put it on the national credit card. They'll print money and raise interest rates to try and control inflation. Bottom line is, this is, and to your point, it is government overreach on steroids. That's absolutely right. It would be funny if it wasn't true. In fact, it's not funny. It's scary.
Yeah.
But it is popular, though, Deneen. I mean, can you deny that it's not popular, particularly with younger voters?
Maybe for some, but they don't really know what's involved and what the cost is going to be, because we're going to end up paying for this nonsense. So this isn't reality. They're looking to do away with fossil fuels. Are you kidding me? In 10 years? So what are we supposed to do? You know, heat your home, cool your home, how you're going to drive your cars? They don't want you to do that. It's all about government control, and it's outrageous.
I think what people do support, and to the point that you ask 10 people on the street what the Green New Deal is, 10 people will tell you 10 different things. But what people do support and why this is popular is because people do believe that climate change is a serious national issue, and they do believe that we need to
Is it serious enough to destroy entire industries?
Perhaps not, but it's an opportunity to both grow the economy strategically and rethink the ways we do lots of things in this country. And so people see that as an opportunity. That's where the New Deal terminology comes from.
We found after the Paris Accord, right, that in the last couple of years, America's CO2 output has actually gone down, in part to natural gas.
Correct.
While China, India, that's the problem. And so how can Americans, and why should Americans, foot the bill in a foolish attempt to curb climate change when the rest of the world, the key polluters out there, aren't going to stop?
And the president pointed that out just the other day, and he's absolutely right. Why should we play by these very strict rules when some of the biggest countries out there and the biggest polluters are doing absolutely nothing?
Right.
And by the way, under this scenario, is it the bureaucrats that are going to run all of this? Have you seen how they run the post office? Have you seen how they run Amtrak? The list goes on and
It's
on.
ugly.
We got it.
It's ugly.
Meanwhile, Massachusetts Democratic Senator Ed Markey claiming that this vote is sabotage, and, well, we called them, and so far we've got no response. So the Senate Majority Whip and South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune. Senator Thune, thanks for joining us.
Charles, nice to be with you. Thanks.
The notion that somehow this is sabotage, that Senator McConnell is pulling a fast one, what are your thoughts?
I don't think he's pulling a fast one. I think he's asking people to go on the record and find out where people are on this great, hot new idea that Democrats have come up with that somebody else gets to pay for.
Are you surprised, though, that all the declared Democratic candidates and many of those who are on the cusp of declaring have all said, hey, this is part of our platform, too. We support this?
It is kind of surprising, Charles, but I think if you look at where the Democrat Party in this country is moving, they've taken a hard socialist turn. And the issue with every one of these socialist fantasies is it sounds really good as long as somebody else is paying for it. But when you hand somebody the bill and they realize what the price tag is, all of a sudden they have a different impression. And I think that's where a majority of Americans, as they look at this and they listen to this discussion, that's where they're going to land. They're going to say, okay, they're realists. They're going to say, what does this thing cost? And they're going to do the cost benefit in their own minds and conclude that this is a really bad deal for American workers and American families who are going to get stuck paying the bill for all these socialist fantasies that some on the far left have come up with, and evidently a lot of the Democrat candidates for president have decided to embrace.
Well, if you look at the broad strokes, because that's all we really have, it feels like this perhaps is an extension of the social justice movement that was very prevalent under President Obama. If you look at some of the things, high-quality health care, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security. These aren't necessarily climate change issues. These are sort of issues where they're telling the American public, hey, it's all going to be part and parcel of this major package. Climate change will be the headline, but we'll take care of all the ills of this country.
Right, and I think it stems from the sort of ideology that government knows best. And it knows best when it comes to the decisions that people make in their daily lives. You know, they've got, if you look at the agenda that they've advanced, we're talking about a top marginal tax rate of 70%, a wealth tax at 90%, an increase in the business tax. You're talking about open borders. You're talking about Medicare for All, which costs $32 trillion. And the Green New Deal, which they say will cost the average family about $3,800 more in annual energy costs. So these are they're all part of this sort of utopia that a lot of the government engineers in places like Washington come up with. But in the lives of the American people, they have real practical everyday costs,
Right.
and that's what the American people are going to be looking at.
Senator Thune, speaking of open borders, I got to get your thoughts on this proposed shutdown resolution, or compromise, if you will, and the potential for President Trump to sign it and there being a vote on it.
Right. I think, Charles, there is, as you know, in a negotiation, some give and take. Nobody got everything that they wanted. But the point that I tell people is the president is going to build the wall. And that's what the president wanted out of all this. He's going to get more wall, twice as much wall as was appropriated for in the last fiscal year, and 3 times as much as would have been allowed for in a continuing resolution had the government been funded that way.
Although he's getting a fraction of the money that he requested originally.
Sure. I mean, he's not getting what he wanted, and I think he knows that. There are other ways that he can get some of those dollars by reprogramming existing funds. He'll get there, but this is an incremental process, and this is a down payment. We've talked about it that way, but he is going to be building wall, and he got the Democrats to concede they weren't going to put a single dollar into wall funding. And if you look at what they were trying to do with capping the number of beds, the number of criminals that could be detained by Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, that also was a win. And I think the president can live to fight another day, but he's going to get wall funding, and I think that's the important message coming out of this discussion.
Senator Johnson, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank
you
you.
bet. Yeah.
Hey, so who needs $1.3 billion when you can get 14? Republican Senator Ted Cruz says take the $14 billion in assets tied to El Chapo and build the wall. What does former Obama and Trump ICE chief Tom Homan think of that idea? Well, we're going to ask him. He's next. Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz says, let's fund the border wall once and for all. How? By taking the $14 billion in drug profits and other assets tied to the drug kingpin. But would that work? Let's ask former acting ICE director and Fox News contributor Thomas Homan. Thomas, what do you think of that idea? It seems like a pretty brilliant idea.
Actually, I think it is. Look, he made money, the organization made money because of our weak border. Use that money to help secure the border. I think it makes perfect sense.
Of course, some may argue the way he made the money, people died over the money. Maybe it's blood money. I mean, would that be pangs of consciousness with respect to that? Or considering, the sort of social
Charles,
benefit?
if you're talking to me, I cannot hear anything. Someone's stepping on you.
Okay. We'll keep trying, Thomas Homan. In the meantime, just to let you know, we did also reach out to Senator Cruz on this, and so far we have not heard back. But it is an interesting idea, to say the least. $14 billion, and you have to weigh them, right? You have to weigh on one hand the idea that this money we'd have to consider it blood money. On the other hand, though, border security, which would help everyone, help Americans. It would also help those on the other side of the border making a dangerous trip. Thomas, so as I was just saying, it's a complicated proposal. $14 billion is very enticing, but it's money that did come at the expense of a lot of people's lives.
It did, but I truly believe this, Charles. You build that wall, you're going to save a lot of lives. Look, we had 2 children die, which was a tragedy, but they came to a part of the border there wasn't a wall. Look, that wall would save lives to help. The illegal alien population coming through the border right now are paying off the cartels. The cartels are making money because the alien smuggling organization must pay them to work through their plazas. So this makes perfect sense. Build a wall, cartels get less money. Illegal aliens can go to the port of entry rather than paying these cartels. It's going to hurt the cartels' bottom line, and it's going to save lives. It's going to save a lot of lives. Border Patrol last year saved 4,000 people that were in trouble coming across that border. This makes perfect sense to me.
Now, most of these assets are in Mexico, so there would probably have to be some form of negotiation with Mexico. Do you think they would be okay with that?
Look, I think they should be. I mean, they've had a war on drugs in their country for many years, and I think this will help, hold the cartels in check. And look, it's the right thing to do. I mean, their citizens are dying too, and people in Central America are transiting their country, and they're dying. I mean, thousands of people have died. Look at the latest stat. 31% of the women being smuggled through Mexico from Central America are being raped. And that's the Doctors Without Borders number. That's not an ICE number. It's not a DHS number. It's the right thing to do for the people.
The compromise negotiated 55 miles of border wall, substantially less money than President Trump wanted, although substantially more than Nancy Pelosi said would be offered. Are you okay with this? Are you okay with President Trump signing this and perhaps finding other resources? and living to fight another day, or should President Trump draw a line here and continue to hold against for a larger amount?
Until I see the language and exactly what they're trying to propose, because I've seen 100 different stories, I think it holds the line. I do not like to deal when you got illegal immigration on the rise and you're going to take beds away. To me, you don't have to be a genius. That doesn't make sense. And they're proposing 42,000 beds for ICE. They got 49,000 in custody today. So that's going to cause a release of criminals. That's just a stone cold fact. So I don't like what I see. I'd have to see the language in the appropriations bill to find out, can they transfer money? Because last year they transferred money, everybody had a fit. If it requires House approval to transfer money, that's never going to happen. So I'd like to see the language.
Thomas Homan, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Coming up.
On February, that was not a question. That was I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
Fireworks today between Democrat freshman Ilhan Omar and President Trump's special envoy to Venezuela, Elliott Abrams. What started it? We're on it.
Two counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question. That was not a question. That was I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
A heated exchange between Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and U.S. Special Representative to Venezuela Elliott Abrams during a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on Venezuela. Rich Etchen has the latest. Rich.
Good afternoon, Charles. And this is a return to Latin American policy for Elliott Abrams. During the Reagan administration, he served as an assistant secretary in that region. And so a number of Democrats are asking and questioning whether his experience in the Reagan administration and that administration's intervention in civil war in El Salvador, for example, robs him of the credibility that he needs to serve this administration.
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and I
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Abrams says he was promoting democracy in Latin America then. He also fielded questions previously about his involvement in Iran-Contra and whether that hampers him at all in his dealing with Latin American leaders today. He says that leaders are focused on the events of 2019 there, not the events of the 1980s. Charles?
Thank you very much, Rich. And now to this.
I'm not sure how to put it any clearer than I said it before. We have no factual evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia.
Pretty clear statement from Senate Intel Committee Chairman Richard Burr, but his Democratic counterpart has some issues with claims of no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. The Fox News Channel's Catherine Herridge with the very latest. Catherine.
Well, thank you, Charles, and good afternoon. The committee's ranking Democrat is not going as far, pointing to what Senator Warner describes as suspicious contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials, telling reporters, quote, when you've got a campaign chairman sharing polling data with a known Russian agent, when you have as many as indictments that has come out of the Mueller investigation, when you see the level of unprecedented contact between Russians and folks within the Trump campaign. And there may be more legal exposure for the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, after he failed to show for the Senate committee's subpoena, citing medical reasons.
I can assure you that any goodwill that might have existed in the committee with Michael Cohen is now gone. The way he's positioning himself, not coming to the committee, we may hope him to go to prison.
Burr was angered by media reporting that Cohen was out and about last weekend, as well as Monday night. Cohen testified before the same committee 2 years ago about a Moscow real estate project in 2016. Cohen later pled guilty to lying about those facts. Cohen's attorney offered this defense to Fox News. The medication Mr. Cohen is currently taking made it possible for him to testify this week. Impossible, rather, to testify this week. We believe Senator Burr should appreciate that it is possible for Mr. Cohen to be in pain and still have dinner in a restaurant with his wife and friends. Meantime, House Democrats now plan a vast probe of President Trump and Russia with a strong focus on money laundering that will include multiple committee hearings and public events that could last well into 2020. Republicans accuse Democrats at this stage of moving the goalposts. First, it was a junior Trump campaign aide, George Papadopoulos. Then it was the anti-Trump dossier that was funded by the DNC and Clinton campaign. And now they have a new focus on the money trail. Charles.
Catherine, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, we're getting a reaction to all of this from Ohio Republican Congressman and member of the Oversight Committee, Jim Jordan. He's coming up in just a few minutes. And to a real crisis, both parties are ignoring. The nation's debt is soaring, now $22 trillion and counting. And while these guys stick their head in the sands, guess who is going to end up getting stuck with the tab?
Nearly 250,000.
They are very, very telling. Happy Valentine's Day, fellas. And instead of both political parties screaming about cutting spending, they're actually increasing it. Here now to debate Payne Capital Management President Ryan Payne and National Taxpayer Union Senior Fellow Maddie Doppler. Maddie, there was a time when this was sort of news. I mean, are we just so numb to it now we don't care?
Well, I would argue that both politicians and Americans have become somewhat inured to the notion of the growing national debt. And sometimes you can't blame them, right? Couple trillion here, couple trillion there. All of a sudden you're talking about real numbers. But I think that clip you played was right on. We are careening towards a cliff and we don't know how to stop ourselves. Now, in some ways, it's alarming but not shocking that politicians have not started to use the national debt as an issue that they actually want to try and tackle. But frankly, if you look into the future, $22 trillion now, but $1 trillion every year after that really starts to make a dent. And the reason that politicians should care about this is for both political reasons and realistic ones as well. One is that it destabilizes the future for all Americans. So if you're potentially a Republican or a conservative who talks a lot about economic opportunity, those opportunities narrow as the debt continues to squeeze out other kinds of investment. But if you're a Democrat and you think the federal government should be spending on a lot of different programs, those priorities will also be undermined by the fact that the debt will take up a greater part of the federal budget.
Well, in the Green New Deal, I mean, this $22 trillion probably be a drop in a bucket, Ryan. But, you know, to Maddie's point, there will be a time very soon when we're spending $1 trillion a year on the interest. And when Americans think about what that money could be used for other than that, then I think people start to get upset.
Yeah, that's a good point, Charles. I think the big thing is we've been really lucky because, let's face it, interest rates have been extremely low. So our debt service hasn't been astronomical. But the reality of it is, you know, inflation's starting to go up, not astronomically here. Interest rates have already started to go up since the midsummer of 2016. So that at some point here, as interest rates rise, debt service goes up, and then it becomes a real big problem for the economy, almost an anchor.
But it's not a problem
yet,
though, is it? We had a CPI number out today. It actually keeps going down. There's no signs of real classic inflation. And many people wonder in this Amazon era, Ryan, if we'd ever get this sort of 1970s, early 80s inflation, if that's even possible. And if not, maybe that emboldens politicians to keep spending more.
I mean, sadly, yes, it probably does embolden politicians to keep spending more. But I think we have to think about is at some point that's going to slow the growth of the economy. And when you have global economies around the world that are starting to grow faster than the U.S., money's going to start to leave the U.S., which hence is going to raise interest rates.
Maddie, you know, you always present it in a very logical way, but you're not running for election or re-election. How do we get folks who want to stay in Washington, D.C. forever, right? They want to bring the bridge to nowhere back home to get re-elected. How do we get them to understand the urgency of the problem?
Yeah, Charles, inarguably, the bias towards spending is a hard one to correct for the institutions here in Washington, D.C. But listen, you look at the Congressional Budget Office, you look at the other bean counters here in town, it is clear what the problem is. They tell us over the next 10 years that revenues are going to stabilize around their historical averages, but spending is going to continue to spiral out of control. So it's going to take some bravery from politicians on both sides of the aisle to start tackling some of these problems. You know, the point made earlier by Ryan, the fact that we've got a debt that's going to get more expensive for the federal government probably isn't going to be an issue until we start to see consequences for private industry. And I'm talking about the debt limit that's coming due on March 1st. We'll see in the summer when that debate continues to pick up. But politicians need to start feeling the pain that private enterprises feel when they're making these decisions about how they're going to service their own debt.
Maddie, Ryan, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Charles.
And the mainstream media calling the border compromise a huge loss for President Trump. Time to call out the huge hypocrisy. We report, you decide, next.
This deal gives Trump less than $1.4 billion for just 55 miles of fences. The border is 2,000 miles. So, of course, they'll need to set aside money for signs that say, please attempt to cross only at fence.
The president also says he's proud of what he accomplished, but keep in mind, it's unclear, even by his own terms, what he really accomplished.
This reminds me of Homer Simpson and Lionel Hutz negotiating with Montgomery Burns, where he says, I have another offer for you, and hands him a slip of paper that says 0, and they go, we'll take it.
Well, the mainstream media mocking a loss for President Trump on a nearly $1.4 billion border wall deal. But my next guest says, what about this?
Is there any situation which you would accept even $1 of wall funding for this president in order to reopen the government?
$1? $1? Yeah, $1.
Now, to be fair, that was from the last shutdown fight, but $1 turned into $1.4 billion. To the Washington Examiner's Byron York. Listen, Byron, I think the media was going to call President Trump a loser on this no matter which way it came out. But, of course, potentially avoiding another government shutdown, potentially moving the ball and getting this going. Everyone says you got to go to D.C. and compromise. Do you think that this is a win or a loss? Where do you assess it?
Well, I think you have to look at it two ways. Politically, it was not a win. He wanted $5.7 billion. Looks like he's going to get around $1.4 billion. So that's not nearly as much as he wanted. On the other hand, take a look at this as a policy matter. The president and the Trump administration are already in the process of replacing about 125 miles of fencing that is completely dilapidated, ineffective, very porous. They're going to replace it with this new steel slat design that the president talks about, which really will be a huge improvement in security for those 125 miles. Now, with this deal, he has the apparent okay to build 55 additional miles on currently unfenced area, in which, again, using the steel slat pedestrian fencing model, which will be pretty effective. So it's not what he wanted, but it is an improvement. And I think that if you talk to a number of experts on the border, they will say there are these areas that if you fence even a relatively small part, you can improve the situation.
Yeah, I think almost any border or security expert would say that, and that's why some of the folks, even on the other side of the aisle, have walls around their primary residence. Do you feel, though, sometimes, Byron, that this whole thing vis-a-vis the president, vis-a-vis the media, is that they're trying to push him, trying to goad him? They want him to, take to Twitter, to make perhaps rash decisions, instead of really pure reporting. Is this sort of a deliberate attempt to try to push President Trump at some sort of tantrum?
Well, there was certainly a lot of mockery in the clips that you just played, and that goes with the territory. That is what coverage is of so much that President Trump does. I mean, you could make fun of Nancy Pelosi if you wanted to. I mean, she's just apparently on the verge of approving 55 miles of immorality. So it seems to me that she's probably given up something here, too. But here again, try to keep your eye on the ball. Look at this as a policy matter. Would it be better to build these 55 miles of new fencing or better not to? The answer is it would be better to do it.
Byron York, always the voice of reason. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles.
Hey, what's really up with President Trump and Russia? The Senate Intelligence Committee chair says they turned up nothing. The Mueller report might not say anything, and so now House Democrats vow to keep the investigations going anyway. How are their Republican counterparts going to react? Jim Jordan is next. Jim Jordan, Congressman, what's going on here?
Well, I think the Senate Intelligence Committee chairman told us what we already knew. There's not one bit of evidence of any collusion, conspiracy, coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia. What they should be investigating, what we should be investigating, but Democrats don't want to do this, is all the terrible things that happened at the top levels of the FBI when they started this investigation in the first place in the summer and fall of 2016. That's what we should be focused on. So this was nothing new.
Yeah, and maybe that might eventually happen. But, the feeling I'm getting reading the last couple of days, particularly after the Senate came through with their conclusion, is people are starting to feel like maybe this Mueller investigation is going to end with a whimper. Yeah. And the Democrats are ready to pick up the baton and start the race all over again. And it just seems like an affront to the American public, who I think is just tired, the fatigue of investigations after investigations. If it takes more than 2 years and you come up with nothing, then what would the Democrats be looking for?
Well, remember what we just learned, Charles. The head of the House Intelligence Committee, Chairman Schiff, was caught hanging out with Glenn Simpson in Colorado. There actually is a photo of it. So here you got the guy who's been pushing all these different investigations, talking about more investigations into President Trump. And here's the guy who was hanging out with Glenn Simpson, who paid for the dossier, who hired Christopher Steele, who hired Bruce Orr's wife, Nellie Orr. That same guy. Oh, by the way, the same chairman of the Intelligence Committee who called on Devin Nunes to step down 2 years ago. So maybe, look, what we're seeing from the other side, and what we should be focused on, Charles, never forget this fact. Never forget this fact. Jim Comey fired. Andy McCabe, deputy director at the FBI, fired, lied 3 times under oath. Jim Baker, chief counsel, demoted, then left the FBI, currently under investigation by the Justice Department. And, of course, Peter Strzok, deputy head of counterintelligence, demoted, fired, and Lisa Page, demoted and left. The top 5 people. When have you ever seen that happen at any other federal agency? So maybe that's where we should put our focus and do a real investigation.
And I do want to let the audience know we reached out to Representative Schiff, and we haven't heard back just yet. So the point is, though, is that the Democrats are in charge of the House now, and they have been champing at the bit, and they've made, for some of them, this was a sort of a campaign promise. But I think for most Americans, we're just a little bit worried about the idea of so much investigation, not enough legislation to keep this country moving. What do you say to your Democratic colleagues about this?
Stop the focus on stopping the president at all costs and actually focus on helping the country. Their whole, we saw this on day one. Very first day of this Congress, what do we have? We had articles of impeachment filed the very first day. So they're already ready to move to that before the Mueller investigation is done. So that's been their focus all along. Stopping the president, not helping the country. Let's focus on helping the country.
We've got some news that's just coming in. The House voting to limit U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. The vote is being viewed by most as a rebuke of President Trump's alliance with Saudi Arabia. Representative
I disagree.
Jordan,
yeah.
So how did you vote? What was your vote?
I don't view that at all. I just view this as a constitutional duty. We should be authorizing use of force. Remember what was in this resolution. It still allows intelligence sharing to continue. That was an amendment offered by a Freedom Caucus member, Ken Buck from Colorado, that passed. And also the most important amendment that was added to this legislation was the language that said—
But you did vote to limit U.S. involvement in Yemen.
I voted for this, but we added language in there that said stop the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of the State of Israel. That was also added to this bill, as well as language that said no, stop this anti-Semitic stuff that we're seeing.